I think probably the biggest challenge is professionalization on both a conceptual level and a practical level, because still a lot of these places are developed like we developed it back in the early 70s, is in people have a passion, they want to do something, they set something up, and then they fight forevermore trying to survive, basically. So if you can find ways to support your work and you also get an overview so you can begin to look into the future, because one of the biggest problems for these centres is that they are all short term. They can't plan because everything is crisis management. And so it's going from project to project all the time. So the context is always crisis. So how do you, for Transfer Pals, I guess the question is, how do you shift from crisis management to sustainability? How do you make that shift? And Transfer Pals that's a big part of the work of the organisation, is to try and bridge that gap all the time. And it's difficult, and it's all pervasive. It's very difficult because most places, independent cultural places, have very little money, very little support. They're doing a huge amount on shoestrings with a huge commitment from the people involved. And there's usually a core of a few people who are doing everything and running everything. So if they leave or something happens, then the whole organisation goes down. Or if they hit a crisis, it's really difficult. So I think, you know, the real challenge is to move from that crisis management to sustainability, where you can actually begin to plan for the future. You can actually begin to say, okay, now. And one of the big problems as well that we've identified is, and I would say it very categorically, is that in this area of work, success is actually failure, and you really have to be careful of that. And by that I mean is, if you're successful, then the expectations rise. So say you get a grant to do a big project. That money flows in, but the organisation usually doesn't develop with that big influx of money. The core staff are still the same, and they're expected to deliver on something. If you are a commercial business, the bottom line is money, so that if you're successful, you get loads of money in, which means you bring on board more staff, you get better facilities, you get better supports, you get better IT, so you invest in the company. So your success develops. In the arts and in culture and independent culture, if you're successful, your supports don't develop. You're expected to do twice, 3 times, 4 times as much with the same resources. And that's a big problem. So you have to be aware of that possibility. Absolutely, all the time. That's a big problem. And I think it's a fear as well, because I think if you're involved in a project, a grassroots movement, and you have invested and you're committed to the values of it, and then there's the idea of professionals who could maybe do the job much better, there's always a fear maybe that first of all you'll be taken over, but second of all that you in some way will look bad because you don't have these skills. You know, you're not a manager, you haven't been trained as a manager, you're not an accountant, you're not a, you know, whatever. So for a lot of these centres, they are people who have committed to an idea and they really don't have the capacity, if the project begins to develop with it. So there's usually a crisis somewhere down the line where the organisation reaches a certain point and it has to either finish or it has to develop. And to develop, it has to put in place professional services, professional supports. And there's usually a big crisis in the organisation then, because the founders and the people who are the grassroots people don't have the capacity to bring it on to the next level. You have maybe funders or maybe even board members, executive committee members who want to bring it on to the next level, are pushing for professional staff and trained staff, and there's usually, yes, it's almost a cliche. It happens in every organization almost. No, there's no such thing as a European idea. And that's really important, because I think what you do have is an international idea. I think the interculturalism, I think, is the most important thing, not multiculturalism, interculturalism. And I think the openness and capacity to reach across borders and to be able to develop an international perspective, which is very enriching, where I'm bringing my cultural experience to you and you're bringing yours to mine, and we begin to develop projects or whatever relationships together, is really important. But there is no such thing as a European cultural profile, unless you want to talk about the European Song Contest, you know, which I think is the pinnacle of European Union culture so far. But you know, you can't, I think, talk about a European identity. You can talk about a European sensibility, maybe, but you can certainly talk about a European community of culture that's very diverse, and is really interesting. I really enjoy the meetings that we have, etc., because you really have to take time and you have to have patience to actually be able to communicate. And everybody, if they're sitting around the table, and they do, that's a huge human experience to actually have that. Because everybody's so different culturally, their experiences, their language, their, you know, all of those things. And if you're able to accept that openly, then I think that's a great future for humanity, if you want to call it that. The problem arises if you, on the one hand, are not willing to accept it. On the other hand, if you're trying to create a homogeneous identity, like a European cultural profile, which smacks a little bit of like nationalism to me, then I think those two boundaries are very problematic. Well, I think I'll go back to my own experience. I think independent culture is about allowing different, in fact but different voices to exist equally. That everybody has the right and the capacity to express themselves culturally, and by that I mean to have a voice in the future of the society and the culture that they live in, so that everybody has an equal voice. So this is where it gets political with a small p, because I think the problem with establishment culture, has always been that it has been a pillar of the establishment for actually creating another layer of oppression, right? I think it's no accident that if you look at cultural buildings, that you have banks, parliaments, national theatres, national galleries. They all look the same if you look at them. They all have the Doric columns or the big facades, because they're all pillars of the same mechanism. And in a democracy, I think what you have to do is break that down and actually have an opportunity for people to have a voice, and they can express that voice creatively. That to me is the power of culture and arts. So it should be inclusive, and I think the system has been very exclusive with regard to culture, arts and culture, because there is meant to be one culture. And again, we go back to diversity, but I think independent culture is creating the space for people to actually have that voice. So independent cultural centres should be creating a safe and free space that people can enter and can express themselves. Because the first step to independence is finding your voice and being able to express yourself. And that can be done in any way, shape, or form. It doesn't matter. So I guess going back to my early days, you know, for me, that was what was most important. We couldn't find it within our society, so we set up our own centre to do that. So we'd have a free and open space, and everybody was welcome to actually come and do whatever they wanted. So you had crazy things going on, but that was okay. It was like, you're free here to do this if you want to express yourself in whatever way you want, whatever way that you think is. And then we got a proactive policy of actually going out into the community and creating that space within communities for people. So then you're back into public space. And well, I think you know, Europe is in crisis because the centre has really let us down, in that, you know, our so-called leaders and people who were involved in trying to manage our affairs have totally failed. They're not admitting that they failed, in that they're still continuing with the same policies and trying to put everything back together again. But they failed a long time ago as well. I mean, this is only the one in a long string of crises. But I think it's no different than the 70s or the early 80s, or, you know, even earlier before that with the Great Depression. That what you have is then people coming through saying, we want to create a new world, you know, or the 60s even. We want to create something different. We want to have change. So these centers of change, and they can be conceptual, or they can be buildings, or they can now be on the internet as well, are the places where people can actually go to try and be involved in this change. And young people particularly, you know, there's a lot of movements, a lot of things happening. So that eternal struggle between the, what you might call the establishment or the centre, and everybody else is now still going on. So things change, they develop, they blend into something else, but basically it's this idea that these spaces are there, that people can actually connect and begin to work for a change. And maybe if you look at society over a long period, maybe there has been developments and change that we're just not aware of, you know, but the civilizing, if you like, of our societies, you know, continues, and it's one step forward, two steps back. We're always in that process, but maybe looking at it in a very long-term way, historically and for the future, gives you a perspective on where these centres happen, where these things happen. And arts and culture, you know, has always been at the centre of that. It may not seem like it, but because it's very easily then consumed by the centre and changes into something else. But a lot of the radical movements were led by artistic people or creative people, or people who were interested in creativity, be they writers or philosophers or visual artists or filmmakers or photographers, whatever. You know, they are, in a way, reflect what the progressive nature of humanity is about, should be.